Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, She Stoops to Conquer, Femininity in the Laozi. As we saw in episode 22, when looking at women in Confucianism, ancient Chinese culture was deeply patriarchal. Women were dependent on men for their social status and material security, and were expected to carry out their appropriate roles inside the household, like weaving and child-rearing. The more highly esteemed activities of politics and warfare were the preserve of men. In such a culture, it's hard to imagine anyone thinking that femininity is in any way preferable to masculinity. But let's not underestimate the authors of the Laozi. Though they might refuse to name the unnameable, they were prepared to think the unthinkable, to advise their readers to know the male but keep to the female. The work's interest in the opposition between genders is clearly part of the more general tendency we looked at last time, an exploration of complementary pairs, like heaven and earth, up and down, dark and light, powerful and weak, active and passive. Typically, the Laozi will praise the member of each pair that is commonly despised. It exalts the shadowy valley above the lofty peak, and says to the powerful, have you considered the advantages of being weak? So its surprising preference for the female above the male might just seem to be one more dichotomous contrast to be subverted. But, like a river finding its way into the darkness of a valley, the theme of gender in the Laozi goes a lot deeper than that. As we have learned, the Taoist idea of the complementarity of opposites is based on the concepts of yin and yang. These are correlated to other dichotomous pairs like dark and light, blood and qi, left and right, water and fire. But no pair is closer to the core of yin-yang than female and male, which is often connected to the equally fundamental contrast between earth and heaven. For instance, the 2nd century BCE author Dong Shungshu writes, the yin-yang of heaven and earth should be man and woman should be yin-yang. He was not a Taoist, but a scholar who helped to establish Confucianism as a dominant set of ideas during the Han Dynasty. But that just goes to show that the association of yin with woman and yang with man was one feature of a view that was more widely accepted. From a Taoist perspective, yin and yang are polarities that are in tension, but at the same time necessary to complement the other. In chapter 42 of the Laozi, when it says that Tao produced the one and the one produced the two in question are presumably yin and yang. The somewhat later syncretic text called the Huainanzi, which we've had occasion to mention before, speaks of a sage who harmonized the energy of yin and yang and differentiated between men and women. This suggests that establishing appropriate complementarity between male and female is one way to balance yin and yang. Yet the Laozi does not recommend simply balancing female with male. It actually seems to value the female above the male. The Tao itself is described as mother of the universe, not as both mother and father. That passage carries the gendered imagery further by speaking of the sons of Tao, which are the many differentiated items in the world as we usually experience it. In other passages, they are called the 10,000 things. The perfect sage will understand the sons, but keep to the mother, which of course echoes the aforementioned advice to know the male, but keep to the female. Here then the feminine is clearly thought to be more fundamental than the male. The idea is not that male and female are established together by introducing distinctions into a previously undifferentiated unity. Instead, the Laozi seems to be suggesting that the female takes precedence over the male, perhaps because it is the female that gives birth. We can relate this theme to the mentions of waterways and river valleys that recur throughout the Laozi. This imagery clearly evokes the idea of change, but another point could be that water is fecund. It gives life to plants and animals, making it a perfect metaphor for the generative function of the Tao. Another thing about water is that it always tries to find a path down to the lowest point it can find. Without getting too graphic about it, this is another thing the Laozi associates with women and their procreative role. It expects the woman to be beneath the man when conception occurs, hence the remark that The female always overcomes the male by tranquility, and by tranquility she is underneath. That's part of a more complicated passage we'll return to later, or maybe given the context, we should say we'll return to it below. For now, we can just note that it is from the apparently inferior, lower position that the woman carries out the all-important role of engendering life. It's also important, though off-putting from the modern perspective, that the Laozi expects the woman to be passive in this process. She receives the man in an attitude we've just seen described as tranquility. The ancient commentator Wang Bi captures this nicely, writing, "The male is hasty, restless, and greedy. The female is always tranquil and can therefore overcome the male. Because of her quietness, and furthermore, her ability to stay low, things move toward her." Whereas ancient Chinese society generally valued activity and aggression, the Laozi values what is tranquil and yielding, as when it remarks, "The softest things in the world overcome the hardest things in the world." Ironically, then, it is precisely with reference to rather sexist assumptions about women and their assigned role that the Laozi champions femininity. A modern feminist would surely resist the idea that women are essentially and appropriately passive. The Laozi, by contrast, accepts this prejudice, but then says rather paradoxically that passivity is more truly powerful than activity. Even more paradoxical is the closely related idea that power lies in weakness. Here again, the Laozi uses water as a paradigm case, as in chapter 78. "There is nothing softer and weaker than water, and yet there is nothing better for attacking hard and strong things. For this reason, there is no substitute for it. All the world knows that the weak overcomes the strong, and the soft overcomes the hard, but none can practice it." The chapter ends with the paradigmatically Laozian remark, "Straight words seem to be their opposite." But if we have a paradox here, it is one that is, paradoxically enough, meant to be totally obvious. Everyone knows that water will wear down the hardest things, given enough time. Just consider the river valley created by water that has over the ages reshaped mountain stone. Hans-Georg Müller has suggested a translation that brings out a different, or perhaps just additional, meaning for the first couple of lines. "Nothing in the world is smoother and softer than water, but nothing surpasses it in tackling the stiff and the hard." He dryly adds, "I do not think that one has to be a Freudian to detect a sexual meaning in these verses." It's not an implausible reading, especially since it connects this chapter to the ideas of sexual receptivity and passivity that are clearly present elsewhere in the text. In fact, chapter 52, which we've already quoted, brings together the theme of female generation with that of weakness. After calling the Tao mother of the world, the text adds, "Keeping to weakness is called strength." On the other hand, it would not be like the Laozi to content itself with merely inverting conventional values, to respond to the widespread assumption that female is inferior to male by insisting that no, female is superior. The goal is instead to question traditional oppositions, revealing them as inadequate. Xiao Gan Liu has identified as the most central idea in the Laozi what he calls seeking one side by using its reverse. Rather than simply praising femininity, passivity, and weakness above masculinity, assertiveness, and strength, the text wants us to see the pairs as intimately connected. The point here is reversion rather than replacement. One way to think about this would be that the various dichotomies are ultimately dissolved or unmasked as illusory, or at least as non-fundamental, since the foundation is the unity of Tao. That would be suggested by a sentence like the one we just quoted, which tells us not that weakness is better than strength, but that keeping to weakness just is strength. An alternative way to think about it, though, would be that the dichotomous pair is retained, but with each member of the pair understood in light of the other. They are in fact not opposites, but mutually dependent or complementary, as we explained in the last episode. Both options can be brought to bear on the case of gender. Roger Ames has argued that the perfect sage transcends the male-female dichotomy entirely, reaching a state he calls androgyny. This is achieved by using femaleness as a kind of antidote to harmful aspects of maleness. Here one might think of our modern phrase, toxic masculinity. The male tendency towards pridefulness, ambition, violence, and aggression would be counteracted by a good dose of demure passivity, yielding a sage who is not like a woman, but one who is neither male nor female. In favor of this reading might be the comparison of the sage to an infant who is still too young to smile. That's quite an evocative image, and one open to a number of interpretations. The fact that the infant is not yet able to talk or even communicate by smiling at his mother could suggest a connection to the namelessness of the Tao. This seems to be Wang Bi's interpretation, since he comments, "That is, I am empty, I have no form one can put a name to, and no noticeable signs that can be indicated." But the idea could also be that the infant is so young that it lacks distinguishing or differentiating features, like the uncarved block of wood mentioned elsewhere in the text. Chapter 28 is one place where we find that image, which is intriguing, because that chapter begins with the admonition we've already quoted twice, know the male, but keep to the female. Perhaps then the metaphor of the baby is meant to suggest a child who is like rough wood, not yet carved into any specific shape. This would include the infant's neutrality with respect to gender and sexuality. And notice how natural it is to refer to a baby as it rather than he or she. The idea of transcending the gender dichotomy could fit well with some cosmological remarks in the Laozi. For example, the aforementioned suggestion that the two of yin and yang come from the one, which in turn comes from Tao. Given that yin and yang are so strongly correlated to female and male, this might convey the idea that gender opposition is irrelevant to the most fundamental source of things. Yet the 6th chapter of the Laozi says that the root of heaven and earth is the subtle and profound female, which is equated with the spirit of the valley. Similarly, the ultimate origin of things is called mother several times. Commenting on one of these passages, Wang Bi says, "Mother is the roots and son is the branches. One should find the roots in order to understand the branches, but one should not cast away the roots in order to pursue the branches." The mistake most people make, according to Taoist cosmology, is to be ignorant of the fundamental unity underlying the 10,000 things. Consumed with desire and everyday ambition, people tend to spend all their energy on pursuing the branches, as Wang Bi puts it. But it would also be a mistake to ignore the 10,000 things, which is why he also says that we must use the root to understand the branches. So, if the origin is a mother and its engendered products are its sons, then we need to continue thinking in terms of the contrast between female and male. Rather than abolishing or transcending that pair, we need to grasp the interrelation between male and female and the dependence of the former on the latter. A modern English translation of the Laozi by Edmund Ryden brings this out by using female pronouns for the Tao itself, yielding renderings like, "I do not know her name, I entitle her the way." Ryden justifies this choice not with reference to any feature of the Chinese language, but on the grounds that female imagery, cleft, valley, mother, flood, weakness, is so insistently used to convey the nature of Tao. Alongside this cosmological approach to femininity, there is also its political application. It's of course characteristic of the Laozi to deploy the same concept in both spheres. This brings us back to the longer passage we only touched on earlier, the one that alludes to the tranquility of the woman underneath the man, in an apparent allusion to sexual intercourse. The full passage, however, makes clear that the authors are primarily thinking about politics. A big country may be compared to the lower part of a river. It is the converging point of the world, it is the female of the world. The female always overcomes the male by tranquility, and by tranquility she is underneath. A big state can take over a small state if it places itself below the small state. And the small state can take over a big state if it places itself below the big state. Thus, some by placing themselves below take over others, and some, by being low, take over other states. After all, what a big state wants is to annex and herd others, and what a small state wants is merely to join and serve others. Since both big and small states get what they want, the big state should place itself low. We could hardly have a more forceful reminder that the Laozi was composed in the Warring States period. Faced with a situation of constant warfare between states of different sizes, the authors give typically counterintuitive advice. Normally, one would expect the large state to dominate the small state, forcing the smaller one to accept its inferior status. The Laozi warns that a small state can undermine and ultimately conquer a larger rival from such a deceptively supine position. To ward off this tactic, Large states are advised that they should, as it were, stoop to conquer. Instead of adopting an aggressive policy of conquest, the rulers should be passive and peaceful, letting the rulers of the small state come to them and join the fold, gaining the security they seek within the reassuring embrace of their larger neighbor. Thus, both states get what they want, a perfect example of complementarity and reciprocity in the political realm. It's worth citing the commentary of Wang Bi one more time, not on this passage, but on chapter 10 of the Laozi, which says, somewhat mysteriously, "Can you play the role of the female in the opening and closing of the gates of heaven?" His commentary explains as follows: "The female responds but does not lead, follows but does not act." It means that if you can play the role of the female in the opening and closing of the gates of heaven, all things will submit spontaneously, and you will live in peace. On his reading, then, the gist is more or less the same as in the passage about large and small states. Rather than trying to boss everyone around and force them to submit to you, simply maintain a gentle, peaceful posture and wait for them to submit to you of their own free will. This would, given ancient Chinese cultural assumptions about gender, be a typically feminine approach, to seek a kind of dominance through quiet passivity. You might say that the best way to get things done is not to do anything. Indeed, that's something the Laozi does say, with its famous theme of non-action or wu wei. To find out more about that, you don't need to do anything. Just wait for us to come to you with the next episode of The History of Philosophy in China.